Welcome back to the E3 Rehab YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Tony Camella, physical therapist, and today's topic is hip flexor tightness. The objectives of this video are pretty straightforward. I'm going to review what the hip flexors are, how do you objectively assess potential limitations in these muscles, and what are some of the best strategies for improving range of motion in this area. Let's begin with a review of the anatomy and function of the hip flexors. The hip flexors are a group of muscles located on the front of your hips. The most commonly mentioned hip flexors are the iliopsoas and rectus femoris. However, the tensor fasciae lata, or TFL, sartorius, adductor longus, and pectineus muscles are also primarily responsible for flexing the hip. Hip flexion is in reference to drawing the femur towards the pelvis, such as with lifting the leg, as well as moving the pelvis towards the femur, such as with tilting the pelvis anteriorly. Additionally, with assistance from the abdominals, the iliopsoas muscle is also responsible for trunk flexion. If the hip flexors have decreased flexibility, they can potentially limit the amount of hip extension you move through. Possessing adequate hip extension range of motion can be an important consideration for the performance of various athletic activities, such as with sprinting. Additionally, it can allow you to express more movement variability or explore more movement options that you may not be able to do otherwise. There's not a set amount of hip extension you should be aiming for, but rather how much you need will be dependent on your desired activity and goals. For some, a few degrees may be appropriate, while others may benefit from more. The most well-known methods for assessing hip extension deficits are the Thomas test and the modified Thomas test. The Thomas test is performed by lying on your back on a flat surface and pulling one knee into the chest to maximally flex the hip. This test is scored on a binary scale, either positive, negative, or pass-fail. This test is deemed positive when there's a noticeable gap between the leg and table, indicating a lack of hip extension. The modified Thomas test is similar, however, it is performed on the edge of a table or surface. This test is commonly scored as pass-fail as well. If the thigh is unable to extend to a neutral position or drop below the horizontal, it is considered a positive test. But because the leg can hang off the table, it allows for the additional measurement of an actual peak hip extension angle, as well as a knee flexion angle. Typically, the measurement used to determine hip extension angle is the angle of the thigh relative to the horizontal, or in other words, the hip angle relative to the table. However, this method does not take into consideration pelvic positioning, which can significantly influence results. In 2016, Vygotsky et al. Found that the modified Thomas test has poor reference validity and reliability when pelvic tilt is not controlled. But when controlled, it becomes a valid test for evaluating peak hip extension angle. This means that in order for measurements to be more accurate, hip extension angle should be measured in reference to the pelvis, not the table. This has also shown to be important for minimizing error during knee flexion measurements, as shown by Kim and Ha in 2015. Now, the modified Thomas test is used to assess for a lack of hip extension, and a lack of hip extension is commonly associated with tightness in the hip flexor muscles. So in theory, assuming pelvic tilt is controlled for, the position of the leg may indicate which muscles are limited. For example, since the rectus femoris crosses the hip and knee joint, it may present with more knee extension if limited. And if the knee is bent, but the hip lacks extension, it may indicate limitations of the iliopsoas muscle. However, it should be noted that other structures and factors can limit hip extension, not just the muscles, so these tests are not perfect. Furthermore, the goal should not be to improve hip extension just for the sake of improving hip extension, but rather you should ask yourself, based off my desired activities and goals, would I benefit from improving this motion? If yes, then this last part of the video is going to be helpful, as I'm now going to review some exercises that I have found to be the most advantageous for improving hip extension range of motion. But before showing you those, there's one other point worth mentioning. The sensation of hip tightness is a subjective experience, and by itself is not indicative of a problem. The modified Thomas test is an example of how you can objectively measure hip extension deficits, but it is possible the sensation of tightness can exist without an actual limitation in hip movement. However, if reducing the sensation of tightness is really important to you, then the same exercises we utilize to improve hip extension should also be really helpful for you. Static stretches, or holding one position for a given duration of time, are probably the most well known. While these can be advantageous in some cases, research indicates that dynamic and eccentric stretches may be more appropriate for improving hip range of motion. Here's an example of a dynamic stretch progression. Start in a half kneeling position, tuck your tailbone by squeezing the glutes, and while maintaining this position, rock forward and backward. You should feel a stretch in the front of your hip. To progress, you will perform the same movement but add a side bending component. As you move forward, reach up and over to the other side. And finally, you can add a rotation piece. Same as before, but rotate towards the down leg and side bend away as you rock forward. If you want to bias the rectus femoris, you can perform a similar variation with the back foot elevated. Same as before, you will want to tuck your tailbone, and while maintaining that position, rock forward and backward. This stretch will be felt more in the front of the thigh than the hip. The final progression is going to focus on eccentrics. This will move the hip through a larger range of motion at higher intensities. So in addition to improving hip extension mobility, it can also help develop strength and control. The first movement is a split squat with emphasis on hip extension. Like previously, emphasize a strong glute squeeze in order to tuck your pelvis. While holding this position as best as you can, slowly lower down to the ground and then return back to standing. You should feel a stretch in the front of your hip. To progress, you can elevate the front foot, which will allow you to move into a deeper position. If you want to bias the rectus femoris, you can perform this same movement with the rear foot elevated. To further increase the difficulty of either of these movements, you can hold a weight while performing them. Now, there are a few other topics that frequently come up within the conversation of hip flexor tightness. In a previous video, we already discussed how there's a poor relationship between hip flexor length, pelvic positioning, and glute activation. You can find the links for those resources in the description box below. Other notable topics include anterior pelvic tilt and lower cross syndrome. I obviously didn't talk about either of those in today's video, but we will be reviewing each of those in more depth in future videos. So make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on those. I appreciate you guys watching. If you found the video helpful, tap that like button, share with a friend, and if you have any questions at all, just drop them in the comments below. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.